go. Okay. All right. So as the video showed, you have a lot of tumultuous political wrangling going on to the kickoff to this post Reconstruction era, and the issue again is that the South is not any different, except that slavery is illegal, right? But they are, in a way, re-enslaving through um, unemployment laws. You can't be unemployed, and these laws only apply to African Americans or Southern blacks, and um, they call them black codes, right? And you can be put in jail, and then someone can post your bail, but you have to then work for them for free to pay off this debt, which you don't even know what the debt was. They'll never tell you. They don't give you a straight answer. There's also, um, tenant farming and sharecropping, which is very hard on the person actually renting the property or doing the farming. So things are not going well in the South, right? And the North, I won't say all of them, but definitely Republicans and a lot of the leading industrialists of the North are just tired of pouring money into this Reconstruction issue. Reconstruction was really a failure on several points, okay? But they were trying to struggle through this kind of together, and no one had ever done this before, right? They were in uncharted territory. So by the time we get to the election of 1876, you have, the American attention span is very short to begin with. Um, the South is actively resisting any type of um, valuable Reconstruction efforts. And the federal government has kept troops in the South to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to make sure that blacks are able to vote and exercise their rights that they gained in the last 15 or so years. But the federal troops in the South are the thing that they pick on the most, the Southern Democrats, because that to them is a major roadblock in their attempt to reestablish white supremacy, right? And at this point, the Democratic Party is full of Dixiecrats, is what they call them, but basically they're white supremacists of the South. And they are pushing for kind of a return to normalcy for them, which is the reestablishment of white supremacy in the South. And Republicans at this point, right, Republicans are kind of founded on the idea of getting rid of slavery, and labor should be paid, and everyone should have the option for a free and fair wage. So as this being kind of the basis of the creation of the Republican Party, the fact that they abandon it, really, or abandon Reconstruction in 1876 is one of those kind of political 180s that maybe people didn't expect. The reason they abandoned that, the reason they allowed federal troops to be removed, is because they wanted a Republican president. They wanted Rutherford B. Hayes to win. And they were afraid he would not, because without those three key states, he would not win. And Tilden won the popular vote, right? So it was very possible that Rutherford B. Hayes would be losing the presidency, and Republicans wanted to maintain control of the presidency. They were already losing ground in the Senate and the House, because as they reincorporated those southern states and federal troops were removed state by state, based on the laws of Reconstruction legally, Democrats retook over power in those states, and therefore their representatives were Democrats, and the Republicans were losing ground in the Senate and the House of Representatives to Democrats. So they wanted to at least maintain control on the president. But this does kick off, like the video stated, a series of very ineffectual, inept, and unwilling presidents to really go out there and support policy or challenge their party and really kind of move forward for the American people, right? And we'll get to that, I believe, in the next chapter or two. But this kind of leads into chapter 15, the South and the West, and this kind of helps to explain why people left, right? Why do you want to go west? Why, why do we want to go to the Southwest? It's full of desert, right? We don't have air conditioning. So why are people moving? This mass migration, because it really is a migration, is due to what we would call pull and push factors. So those push factors would be the Klan in the South, the Black codes, lack of economic opportunity, and in the North, right, Blacks did go north. They call that the Great Migration up into Detroit and Chicago, other burgeoning cities that offer economic opportunities in these big factories that they're creating. These barons of industry are supplying lots of jobs, but they're mostly in northern cities because they have the infrastructure to support them. So people move for better opportunities for their family. But that doesn't mean that everything is, it isn't the great promised land that maybe they thought it was. You don't have the Klan, really, and you don't have a lot of white supremacy in your face all the time, but there is racial segregation. There is prejudice, right? That doesn't go away. So there's those issues, but you could go west. And through several pieces of legislation, like the Homestead Act, did not exclude anyone based on race or gender. So you could go out west. You would lead a pretty solitary life. You wouldn't have a whole lot of infrastructure to support you, but you would be free, right? And out west, there is a lot more egalitarianism. It's not 100%, right? But we're not even 100% there today. But you get it's better treatment. And the main reason for that is that it's so underpopulated, you have to depend on your neighbors, right? Even if you're miles away from each other, the community and the need to build that community overrides a lot of these racial prejudices. So here. The major industries of the West are going to be mining, lumber, farming, ranching, and the railroad. Right. Mining, again, is going to be precious and semi-precious metals. Most of that is going to take place in the Southwest. And there are some mines that go up into the Pacific Northwest. But again, a lot of that is based on that vein of gold they found in the 1840s in California. But there's a lot of silver and tin and copper in the West. So you see an influx of mining jobs there. You also see out west more multiculturalism in the fact that you're going to see more Asian Americans there. And they come through the ports of San Francisco and what will later become LA. And they are usually more skilled in the mining industry. They tend to have more experience with explosives, and they're shorter. I mean, that's kind of a stereotype, but mining is hard work, and you have to, bend down on your knees a lot. And Americans are already 2 inches taller than their European counterparts. So as a people, all Americans, including African Americans, are taller than most. And at the time, the immigrants that were coming from the different countries in Asia tended to be a bit shorter, and so they were utilized a lot in the mines. That doesn't mean, that was everyone, of course. We don't want to stereotype anybody. But that made it easier for them to get jobs there. You will see some restrictions on Chinese labor throughout this industrial period because of the prejudice, and also they're taking our jobs, right? The immigrants are taking our jobs. That is an age-old rallying cry. Trust me on that one. But the truth was nobody wanted those jobs, as they don't today, right? And the other people that you found, especially with explosives, were Irish immigrants. They were more than willing to do the explosives. Lumber, okay, you're going to see a lot of immigrants coming in from Northern Europe. Your Vikings, your Scandinavians, right? They're not Vikings anymore, but your Swedes, your Norway, Norsemen, the Denmark, right? These Northern European, Scandinavian countries come into the Northwest um, as highly skilled lumberjacks, right? And so you see that industry pulling in because the Pacific Northwest is mainly forest, right? If not all forest, or it was. And so in those areas, like the northern states, North Dakota, Montana, Wisconsin, uh, Washington, Washington not as much because it's on the coast, but you still hear Minnesota, that Scandinavian dialect in there, right? Minnesota, North Dakota, right? So they have a specific accent, like say a Southern accent or a Texan accent or New England accent, right? They definitely have one, and it goes back to their roots as having a lot of immigration from Northern Europe. So you do see people flooding in for that. Oil, but oil will become a little later, um, and that's going to be oil wells, and then of course refining and moving the oil, pipeline building. Okay, and Rockefeller's the first one to build a pipeline. So we'll go over him quite a bit, I'm sure, in the next chapter. Farming and ranching, okay, very similar, and they often do a little bit of both. Farming is somebody whose livelihood depends on crops, right? Something that grows in the ground. That doesn't mean that the farmer doesn't also have cows, horses, goats, pigs, whatever, but his main source of income is from crops grown in the ground. Ranching, similar. His main source of income, her main source of income, because there were female ranchers, is from livestock, either cows, pigs, goats, whatever. They also probably have a small farm to feed their families. Okay, so these two kind of overlap a little bit, but their main concentration is on water. In other words, you can't be successful at either one of these unless you are located close to or able to utilize a fresh water source, right, via rivers, lakes, etc. So a lot of these, they kind of depend on, and that explains why they settle in areas they settle, right? A lumberjack doesn't need to be near a lake. It needs to be near the forest. A farmer and rancher needs to have access to the water, so they're probably not going to be in the forest, right? Um, and so these are the major industries, and then of course the railroad. The railroad pulls people out west. For labor, right? You need to have somebody to build them. So these are jobs that are being offered by the railroad. It's also infrastructure, providing a way to get your farmed or ranched goods, lumber or oil back to, say, these hubs like St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, right? The railroad is going to take that product back for you. So it's a very, very important and key to the development of the West. You could not really have this movement or this development without the railroad, without a way to get it there. And the railroad is really where you start to see your first robber barons, is what we call them, or captains of industry. And these are people that create monopolies over an industry. All right, and we'll spend probably a lot more time in chapter 16 in describing what a monopoly is and how you vertical and horizontal integration. But your first one is coming through the railroads, right? And that is, his nickname was Commodore Vanderbilt, right? And he was originally in shipping, steamboats, etc. Right before the Civil War, he sells off a huge chunk of his shipping industry, his shipping company, and invests in railroads. And everybody is like, oh, that was stupid, right? You shouldn't have done that. Well, he shows them all, because not only does he continue to make money during the Civil War, which practically nobody else does, but he makes it huge after because of this railroad industry. So these are the things that are pulling people out west. And we said our push factors were several of those. In the north, people are trying to get away from the city as well, right? The northern city, and again, this kind of goes into industrialization, is becoming very dirty, uninhabitable, crime-ridden, and so people don't want to live there. So they move out west, right? And for the first time, because of these industries, your immigrants can move directly out west as well, because they don't have to have capital to be a laborer in any of those things. Okay, so in the South, we kind of talked about this. We went over Reconstruction, the New South, tenant farming and sharecropping. The difference there is a tenant farmer pays rent for the land that he's using, so it's a set amount usually. He pays it up front, and then he rents the land, farms it, and he gets the money and develops what he needs for the next year. But as this is only 10 years after the end of the Civil War and 12 years after the end of the Civil War, you have issues with the fact that there are not a lot of tenant farmers that can read and write. And this includes poor whites, because there's quite a large population of poor whites in the South that are tenant farmers and sharecropping. And they are not really given fair contracts. So most of the time they end up just in more and more debt to the people who own the property. Sharecropping is where you don't pay rent, per se, on the land. You agree to share the profits, or actually, no, you agree to share the amount of money that is earned from the product that is sold. Okay, it's not technically profit. So you work the land, you sell whatever it is you're selling, cotton, tobacco, corn, and let's say you get $500. Then you have to split that $500 with the property owner. That's what's called sharecropping, and they get X amount of percent, right? Well, let's say you get $1,000 and they get 25%. So they get $250 off the top. Here's the problem with that. That's not technically profit, because profit is what you have left over after you pay all your bills. So now you're down to $750, right? But you have to go and settle all your debts. So let's say that comes out to like $500 for the year. You now have $250 to start for next year and to feed your family for a year, right? So we already know it's going to cost $500. So you're going to start out the next year in debt by $250. Then you add on what it's going to cost. Say it's going to cost $500 that year. You sell your crop for the same amount, and now you're broke. You come back and you break even, but you have no money to start up the next year. So the sharecropping is, again, not profitable for the person actually doing the farming. And so you see people leaving the system, and leaving the brutality that a lot of them are experiencing. All right, so on the railroad, funding. So the way the funding works is interesting. But the Transcontinental Railroad was one of the Republican Party platform when they first got the presidency with Lincoln in 1860. The idea is that you want a railroad that goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the federal government gives contracts to two railroad companies, and they agree to meet in Promontory Point, Utah. Right? So they have to create a railroad that meets up there. Now, let's see, let's get you a map of political map. Not a red and blue one. Swear to God, if I see another red blue map, it'll be too soon. Okay, so right here's the United States, and Promontory Point, Utah, is like here, right up here by Provo. So the Western contract, you think that's not very far to go, whereas the Eastern contract is a lot. But let's also remember that we have railroads that come at least to Kansas City, so they only have to go, this far. So it's the length that they have to build is not as much as you would think. In addition to that, they don't have to go over the Sierra Nevadas, right? Kansas is flat. Colorado is flat until you get to the western side of Colorado, right? And then you have to go over the Rockies, and then you get to Utah, right? So it turned out to be actually a very equal settlement in that regard. But how are the federal government going to fund this? What they did was a plan in which they sold pieces of land to the railroad. Give me a quick second and let me see if I can show you this. So the federal government is land rich, but cash poor. So the issue that they have is is that they don't have the cash to start up, to pay these companies outright. So they agree on an initial kind of cash payment to get them started, and then they buy their services by donating federal land to these different companies. But they can't just donate large tracts of it, because then the federal government won't be able to access those railroad hubs. So they do it in a checkerboard pattern. And I'm going to see if I can pull up a map so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. Actually, it's easier to look this way. And if they don't have one, I'll just draw one for you for next time. But this was a way to compensate the railroads for not having to pay them cash. Okay. And the railroads, of course, are going to require a lot of labor. And so they start employing, at least the Western Company begins employing vast amounts of Asian immigrants, and the like Southern Pacific on the eastern side starts hiring a lot of Irish immigrants and Eastern European immigrants that come out to do this extremely hard labor, as well as African Americans. I don't see a thing there, but I will get you a picture of that or a diagram of that next time. Okay. And so the way they fund it is by giving away these chunks of land. Then the railroads, as they begin building, they become in competition with each other, and they get bonuses for laying 7 miles of railroad a day or 5 miles of railroad a day. So the faster they go, the more they earn. And so they start at this breakneck speed, moving and creating railroads out west. But they don't really have any consideration for the environment, like at all, right? And so you see, they blow up half a mountain. They blow off half a mountainside so that it's easier for them to make that railroad go through there. And they don't necessarily think about the ramifications of this. Regardless of that, they meet in Promontory Point, Utah in 1869, and they have completed the Transcontinental Railroad. So your travel time from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which used to be 6 to 8 months, is now cut down to about 2 weeks. Okay, so you have just a huge amount of opening up of this new land. You've really opened it up to this infrastructure. People are able to travel. People are able to settle out west. And the laborers are probably going to build out west. So you see a lot of this there. But it has impacts, right? It has consequences. And specifically on Native Americans. So we'll just get started with, buffalo hunting. Buffalo herds were so expansive that it could take 3 days for an entire herd to be cleared off of a railroad track so that they could go. And trust me, you do not want to hit a buffalo. Even in a railroad locomotive, it would derail the train. They're just massive creatures, right? And they're stubborn and kind of dumb. But they are not to be messed with. And if you get out there and you try to shoo them off or shoot them or whatever, they'll charge you. So railroad buffalo hunting becomes a huge profit for good hunters, because the railroads hire these buffalo hunters to go out and get rid of these herds. That's their sole purpose. They don't care about the meat. They're not hunting them for trophies. They are hunting them for largest number of casualties, period. They are decimating an animal's population. And they succeed in almost causing extinction of this animal. And the impact of that on Native Americans is catastrophic. right? Because these Native American tribes that have been living out here, living out in the West, and have been fully independent, have relied on the buffalo for their clothing, their meat, their everything. They use all parts of it. They make weapons out of buffalo bone, combs, toothbrushes, everything. They use every last bit of it, and now it's gone, right? All right, so I'm going to stop there today. We'll stop the sharing. Stop